Leadership Learning webinar series. This series provides monthly learning on relevant business topics like today's topic, What's Up with Feedback? The program is hosted by Lake Forest Graduate School of Management. I am Carol Modlin, and I will be your moderator today. I am with Lake Forest Graduate School of Management. Lake Forest is an independent and accredited institution with over 50 years' experience providing practical business leader education. This education comes in the form of MBA degree, certificate programs, a targeted training and development through our Corporate Learning Solutions programs. Corporate Learning Solutions specializes in developing corporate managers and leaders by combining relevant content with the expertise of our business leader faculty to provide customized training, consultation, coaching, and organizational development services to our corporate clients. We are grateful for the sponsorship and generosity of our clients and longtime supporter of the school, Trustmark and the Trustmark Foundation. Trustmark provides access to a full spectrum of flexible benefit solutions, including health plan administration for self-funded employer groups, payroll-deducted voluntary products, group medical benefits, and health and fitness management programs. We are able to bring this webinar to you on a complimentary basis as a result of Trustmark support. Again, I am Carol Modlin, Program Manager of Corporate Learning Solutions, and will be moderating our program today. And before we move into today's program, I'd like to take a moment to go over how we will interact. During the program, you will be invited to participate using chat, polling, and emoticons. To ask questions or submit comments, please use the chat feature, and you can see that down here. When you submit, please make sure you use the drop-down, which is here, and indicate all attendees so that everyone can see what you've typed. Okay. Please also be sure that you are muted and that your video is off for the entire program. That will help us avoid any unnecessary distractions during the program. So let's get ready to go. Please close your other applications so that you're ready to start. And once your applications are closed, please raise your hand, the little emoticon, to indicate that you can hear me. And I'll be watching the feedback. I see some hands going up, so it looks like people can hear me. All right, great. So it looks like we're all set to move into our main program. Thank you very much for raising your hand. So at this point, I would like to introduce you today to Jeff Anderson, President and CEO of Lake Forest Graduate School of Management. Jeff came to the school in October of 2014 and brought with him extensive business and academic experience. He's co-founder of the Chatham Group, a consulting advisory firm that he launched in 2003. And as part of that organization, Jeff worked extensively with senior executives in several industries where he was often involved in providing feedback. We are pleased to welcome Jeff Anderson.
Thank you, Carol. Well, listen, I appreciate everyone taking time over their lunch hour to chat with me about this critical and often misunderstood leadership tool. I got really interested in this topic of feedback many years ago, and when I launched my consulting business 16 years ago, I had an epiphany that since I was going to be working with very senior executives in high-profile situations, the pressure on me to provide really valuable feedback was really large. So as a good student, I dusted off all the training I had had in my corporate and educational career, and during those first several assignments, I spent hours thinking about and preparing for the feedback conversations. But in spite of that, what I discovered over the first year or two was that I was having very little impact on the behavior of the executives. So they were hearing me, I think, but we weren't having a lasting impact of the kind that either of us wanted. So I literally remember the day that I asked myself this question that's on the slide here: what is really going on with this topic of feedback, and why is it so notoriously difficult to do well? And that's what I'd like to spend the next 50 minutes or so with you, is probing what we know about this topic and where that leads us as we all think about how to be more effective in the use of this tool. let's start with a little bit of your own experience. What I'd love you to do now is just chat in your thoughts about the most important thing you have learned about effective feedback.
So the chat box is open now. Please remember, after chatting in your response, to make sure that you send it to all attendees. So just go ahead and type it in, and we will keep an eye out to see what kind of feedback you're providing. Steph, it looks like we've got a couple comments coming in from some people. Action items, a lot of things about action items being specific and timely. Does not make sure it does not hurt feelings. Action honest. It's a gift. Specific and actionable. It looks like we have several people who are saying, Jeff, that it needs to be specific and actionable.
Right. So as people are chatting in, I would encourage the other participants kind of scan over that list, and what pattern do you see? What big bucket do most of these learnings fall into? It strikes me that if you look across them, while not universally true, most of them in some way have to do with the message and how the message is constructed. But for me, the question is that really the most important thing? Should we be spending as much time as we are in the middle of this chart thinking about how do we construct this message? How do we make it specific and actionable? While important, clearly, I'm not sure it's the only important thing or even the most important thing in the equation. If our objective really is to result in behavior change, as shown on the right side of this slide, it strikes me there's a whole bunch of other things going on that deserve our attention as well. The context of the observation we made, what really was going on, who was involved. What about the human being that's involved in this equation? What about the other human being, the person delivering the feedback? What's the history of the interactions and personalities of each of those? So as I started to chart this out, I got really intrigued about trying to get underneath all of this and see if there were some science to this process that might be able to point us in the right direction. So I want to start with what is thought to be the most reputable academic paper on this topic. It's the most frequently cited of any that have to do with feedback. And these two individuals did what we in the academic world call meta-analysis, where they looked at more than 3,000 individual pieces of research that had been done on the topic of feedback. And they aggregated all of them and to look at whether the cumulative results suggested that feedback had a positive impact on its performance. And what they concluded from that was that, yes, there was a modest improvement in performance as a result of feedback. But they also found that in 38% of the situations, the feedback not only did not make performance better, it made it worse. So let's reflect on that for a moment. 4 out of 10 times that we deliver feedback in the workplace, not only is it not having the kind of positive impact we desire in behavior, it's having the opposite impact. And it was that finding that started many years ago a slew of research to try to better understand what really is driving effective and ineffective feedback. In the same paper, they started to hypothesize some of their own conclusions, and they're shown on this chart. They found that Whenever another human being was involved and verbal messages were part of the feedback delivery vehicle, they were far less effective. I like to use the example of if you are preparing a document and there's a spell check and it comes up and told you that you spelled something wrong, we have very little reaction. We correct the word and we go on. On the other hand, if you prepare a document and you give it to a colleague or boss who comes to you with your misspellings marked in red and points them out to you verbally, it's going to have a different kind of impact. They found that very quickly, feedback often when human beings are involved, instead of focusing on how I could have done a task better, we too easily take it as a reflection on ourselves and our worth. So self-esteem issues kick in quite quickly. They found that the more complex the task, the less effective feedback was on average. And they also found that the most effective feedback occurred when an individual discovered it his or herself. So to the extent that they were directed and discovered it without being told directly, it had a more significant and lasting impact on performance. So let's go a little deeper. What do we know about how our brains react to feedback? So some researchers shown there, most notably a guy at the University of Chicago, discovered that there are separate parts of our brain that respond to positive and negative feedback. And the part that responds to negative feedback in particular responds more dramatically than is the case with positive feedback. What I think is interesting about this is many of us have probably been taught the sandwich method for delivering feedback, where we sort of start with something positive and we put in the middle of the sandwich a constructive or negative piece of feedback, and then we top it off with another positive piece of feedback. And this research would clearly say that that method is nonsense, because we can't fool the human brain, which is on alert for these negative signals. The second set of researchers did similar brain research, but what they were focused on was that there's a common part of the brain that responds always to negative feedback, and they showed that we all go through the same sort of filtering process to try to minimize constructive feedback. So we will say, well, he or she doesn't know me very well. This was an isolated incident. It might be true, but it's not very important in the role that I have. And even if it was the case, the consequences were just insignificant. So each of us as human beings automatically go through that process whenever we receive any kind of constructive feedback. All right, so let's do a little test. One of the 5 accepted aspects of personality has to do with how we react to events that occur around us. So think about that little bar as a continuum. On the left are people who are reactive and expressive and show easily reactions to things that happen. And on the other end of the continuum are people who are more calm and even and seemingly inflammable. So we've sort of positioned on this chart 3 people, one at the reactive end, one in the middle, and one more at the calm and even end. And I have 2 questions. We're going to open a poll that I would like you to answer. The first question is, which of these 3 people would be most open to receiving feedback? And the second question is, which of these 3 people would be more likely to alter their behavior as a result of the feedback?
Okay, thanks, Jeff. I've opened up the poll, so you should be able to see the poll on your screen. If you could just click for each of the questions, which person you think would have the reaction described in the question. And I see we have lots of people answering, so thanks for taking the time to click in here. Very interesting. We'll give this a few more minutes, and then we'll close the poll. So a lot of people taking the poll. Thank you very much. Interesting results there, Jeff, don't you think, as they're coming in?
Yes.
We've got a little bit of variability on one and then a little less on the other. We've still got some people responding. Let's give this another 5 more seconds, and then I'll go ahead and close the poll. And then once I close the poll, you'll be able to see the results on your screen. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. We've got another 10 seconds or so while the poll closes until it publishes on the screen. So there we go, another 8 seconds, and then you should be able to see the results pop up on your screen, so you'll see how you fared against what other people thought. Okay, the poll should be published, and you should be able to see the results. So Jeff, I don't know if you want to go ahead and comment?
Yeah, very interesting. So let's talk about those 2 questions for each of the 3 people. So the person number 1, who is at the expressive and reactive end of the continuum, is actually the person who's going to be the most open to feedback. In fact, what we know about people with that personality attribute is that the opinions of others matter a lot to them. And so not only are they open to feedback, they're the kinds of people who would most likely go and solicit it actively, because they really want to know where they stand with others. On the other end of the continuum, person number 3, the person who is calm and even, is unlikely to go seek it out, and they tend to be quite confident in their own position and are just very unlikely to solicit it openly. Person number 2 in the middle, it depends on other situational factors. They can go to either side of the continuum. So the question 2 was, who's most likely to adjust their behavior? Well, in spite of person number 1 being open to feedback, what we know is that because of their reactive nature, they quite easily see it as a reflection on themselves personally and less on their ability to perform a particular task. So it becomes a matter of esteem. And so they get sort of reactive and lost in that, and without a lot of careful coaching are unlikely to modify their behavior. The same thing is true for person number 3 at the other end. As I said earlier, they're not that open to it. They don't seek it out, and are unlikely left alone to modify their approach much based on that feedback. So it's actually person number 2, depending on other situational variables, who is the most likely to alter their behavior. So hopefully that illustrates a little bit that the personality of the person you are delivering feedback to matters enormously when you think about how you want to approach it. Let's look at another variable. Question, we'll maybe chat this one. Has anyone heard of John Gottman, famous researcher?
Go ahead and chat in your response if you've heard of John Gottman. We'll be watching the chat box. Again, please make sure that you send your comments to all attendees. Looks like not very many people have heard about him.
Well, let me fill in the blank. So John Gottman is the most famous researcher on marriages. And in the 1990s, he did a very famous experiment where he brought in hundreds of newlywed couples into his laboratory. And they would come into the waiting room and they would sit, and they thought they were waiting for the experiment, but the waiting room turned out to be the experiment. And he and his fellow researchers videotaped and observed the interactions between the newlyweds. And what they did is they scored every interaction that occurred while they were waiting as either being positive or negative. So the example I like to use here is, thank you for getting me that cup of coffee, positive, or, you know I don't like coffee in styrofoam cups, why did you bring me one? Negative, right? And based only on the ratio of positive to negative interactions, John Gottman and his researchers predicted the probability that that couple would be married 10 years later. And when they came back 10 years later and looked at their predictions, they were right more than 90% of the time, based entirely on that ratio. So now we have a poll for you. Think about the ratio, again, as positive to negative interactions. What was the ratio at which anything above that, the researchers could predict the couple would still be married?
So you should be able to see the poll on your screen now. Go ahead and click in. I think we're going to see how many people are successfully married out there. Okay, pretty even split. Those of you who are married are going to be very interested in the results of this poll, I'm sure, especially since we know that there's 90% correct prediction based on this. And we've got a lot of people, responses are coming in pretty fast and furious. Keep it coming. Okay, I'll give this another couple seconds and then I'll go ahead and close the poll. So if you haven't clicked in, please click in. If you are thinking of getting married soon, please pay close attention to the results of this poll. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now, and in a few seconds you'll be able to see the results. It gives me a 20-second countdown, so as soon as the poll is prepared, you'll be able to see it. Okay. We've got another 5 seconds, and then I'll be able to share it with you. Okay, I'm sharing the poll results. You should be able to see them on your screen. Pretty even split there, Jeff.
Yeah. So the right answer, that again, this was the only variable they used to make their prediction, and the ratio was 5 to 1. Now, I don't know about you. I've been married 35 years. I have a really hard time living up to that ratio, and I'm sure my significant other would say the same. But the data were really compelling. Now, you might wonder, why is Crazy Jeff sharing research on marriages as it relates to feedback? Well, what happened a few years ago was that some researchers decided to take that same philosophy into the workplace and ask the same kind of question in the sense of what kind of environment in terms of positive to negative feedback results in human beings and teams flourishing in a very positive way. And the hypothesis was that in the same way that the research showed with marriages, that the impact of negative interactions was so toxic that it needed a big ratio of positive interactions to offset that toxicity. And what they found, and you can look at this research, and the mathematics are almost incomprehensible, but they found that the ratio in the workplace is around 3 to 1. So I share that because what I've learned is that we cannot think of feedback as an individual transaction out of the overall context of our relationship with that person. So if I've been feeding my colleague or subordinate nothing but constructive criticism in the form of feedback, the likelihood that it's going to have a result in behavior change is low. If, on the other hand, I'm adhering something more to this 3 to 1 ratio over large periods of time, it would suggest that the toxic effect of constructive feedback we offer is going to be muted. So it turns out that the health of our relationship overall with the person we're going to deliver feedback to matters enormously. Here's a question to chat in on. How should a person's level of expertise affect the approach you take to feedback? Any ideas? Chat in with them.
We're watching our chat box, so as you chat in your responses and submit it to all attendees, Jeff will be able to see what your comments were and respond. So I think we've got a couple people chatting in some responses. Significant, greatly. I think there's some agreement out there, Jeff, that it's really important stuff. So thanks again for everybody who's putting in. Oh, we have somebody saying that there should be 8-to-1 ratio of positive to negative.
So I'm going to illustrate this one with a story. Many years ago, our daughter, who's now in her final year at university, when she was 10 or 11, she expressed an interest in playing golf, which was a great news to her father because it's my favorite thing to do. And so my wife and I started by taking her out late on Saturday and Sunday afternoons when there was no one else on the course and to get her started playing. My wife, who's a really talented athlete and quite competitive, would have an endless stream of comments, usually, on the things that Sarah was not doing well. And I could see the impact that it was having on her, so after about the second or third session, I had to take my wife aside and tell her that she wasn't allowed to come along anymore, which thankfully I had enough positive feedback back to our earlier research that I was able to get away with it. And the reason was, what I was trying to do was find every positive thing I could find that Sarah was doing so that her own individual momentum and joy of the game would take over. And in fact, what Ms. Fishbach, a well-known researcher at Chicago Booth, found was that for people who are novices in a particular area, it's important that the feedback be almost entirely positive. Because you want to give them, you want to point to what they're doing well, you want to create positive momentum and commitment on their behalf, and encourage them to continue to develop and learn. On the other hand, now that Sarah's quite an accomplished golfer, when she goes for a lesson, it's not particularly helpful to her and frustrates her when all she gets is positive commentaries. At this point now, she wants very direct, constructive feedback that she can help to get even better. And the same applies in the business world. As we are dealing with someone who has more experience and expertise in an area, they need and are more open to much more critical and constructive feedback. How about this question? How does culture impact how you should approach feedback? So as the little note there says, think globally. So as you are interacting in different cultures or with people from different cultures, how should that impact how you approach this topic? Chat in with your answers there again, please.
We see some people chatting in, some agreement that there is a significant impact that culture has on feedback. Thanks to everybody who's chatting in. Appreciate it. Sensitivity to other cultures is very important. Thanks, Ginger.
I'd like to ask people to be a little more specific. So I would agree it matters a lot, but I'd ask how.
Yeah, so there's the challenge, folks. How does it impact How does culture impact your approach to feedback?
Give us an example of how a person, you're delivering feedback to a person from a particular cultural background, how you might need to adjust your approach.
So we've got one, be careful with your assumptions about gender roles. That's
excellent.
Pretty specific, yep. A sarcastic culture is not good, definitely true. In Japan, a person may lose face. So that's a very specific comment.
That's excellent.
That's a good one. See, it has a lot to do with feedback. You need to understand the culture so you don't offend the people you're talking to. Tone and language, words that you should use.
How about this question? Are there cultures in which giving an individual feedback on their performance or asking an individual to give another individual feedback on their performance would just be inappropriate? Can anyone think of such a culture?
Yeah, well, and going back, Vicki has a comment. She says, understanding the culture of Germany, for example, is a very direct, whereas other cultures, such as India, you may get a lot of agreement but not action. So there's a very specific comment on the impact. So thank you very much, Vicki. That's a really good one. Yep, some gestures or tones are offensive in some cultures. It also depends on the roles that we talk about. So definitely roles do play, and then the three yeses in Latin countries.
Yes. So there's actually some research that would say that there are certain cultures that are more collective in nature. And so there the feedback is more appropriately directed about and to the team than the individual. And in fact, asking people from that culture to deliver feedback to another individual will make them uncomfortable. I just returned yesterday from the Netherlands, where I lived for many years. It's a culture that is known to be open, but is also one which is quite non-confrontational. So in spite of the fact that it is a business environment with extensive unionization and unions who sit on boards of directors, you will rarely see large-scale strikes disrupting business. And so that's a sample of even a European culture where direct feedback to an individual would be out of place unless you knew them very, very well. I could go on. So we've talked about the personality matters enormously, personality of the person that you're going to deliver feedback. The context and state of your relationship with that person matters. We know how our brains react naturally. The cultural context matters. The person's level of expertise matters. There's mountains more of research on other variables that we don't have the time even to explore. But the message I wanted to leave you with is that this is an enormously unsettled field that does not and will not lend itself to a simple model that we can all follow in all situations. And in fact, just like everything else we deal with in our business worlds, it requires careful processing and for us to apply business judgment before we deliver the feedback. So we need to think carefully about what we saw and think deeply about the good things and encouraging things that we saw and the things that we might offer as constructive feedback and sort them into those two buckets. And then we need to go through some steps to process. How well do I know this person? What's their personality like? What's the state of our relationship? What's going on in his or her life right now that would make them more open or not to feedback? What really was the context of the situation? Does it matter? Was it a particularly stressful time? Was it a new task for them? Is it something they've done hundreds of times for years? And only after we've gone through that process do we apply some judgment and think about, how am I going to deliver this message? When am I going to deliver this message? By the way, what we've been all taught about it's important to deliver it right after the event is not necessarily true, because these other variables are more powerful. Maybe you're not even the right messenger. Maybe there's someone else who didn't see the event, but whom they know better and have a better relationship with, who should and could deliver the message. How do you enter into the conversation? I'll tell you in the next slide, one of my big hints for you is that feedback should never, under any circumstances, unless safety is involved, should never be unsolicited. So going up to someone and saying, can I give you some feedback, is unlikely to ever result in positive behavior change. And finally, maybe there's a way you can use more indirect methods of sending messages that help people discover the piece of feedback on their own. In the military world, if you want to look this up after the session, there's a thing that is talked about after action feedback. But what's ingrained into military behavior is after every mission, they process what happened, what the objectives were, what they learned, what they would do differently next time. And because it's an ingrained part of the culture, people will volunteer what they could have done differently without having to be confronted. After-action feedback is what it's called. So before we open it up to questions, I want to leave you with a few of my best practices. Number one, and most importantly, invest in developing the relationship. If you don't know the person well, you have no business giving them feedback because you don't have a way to answer some of the questions we have put forward. Number two, every executive I've ever worked with in 16 years in my first meeting has said the same thing to me. They have said, hey, Jeff, one of the things you need to promise me is that you're just going to give it to me directly. Just tell me what I need to know. I can take it. Don't put any spin on it. And my first year or two, I used to do that. Not anymore. Because while people will say that, almost no one really means it. And just because they say it, and even if they do mean it, it doesn't mean that they will respond well to it. Think back to some of the other things we had been processing. To the maximum extent possible, steer the person towards self-discovery. I'll give you an example of that. You come out of a meeting with customers, and you're driving the rental car back to the airport, and your job may be just to ask questions. How did that go? What'd you think? What could we have done differently? Did you see the reaction of the CFO when we talked about X? Why do you think that happened? All you're doing is trying to open up the conversation so the people involved can discover that for themselves the things they could have done more effectively. And as I said, under no circumstances ever, unless personal safety is involved, should you deliver feedback that's unsolicited. So the job is to try to figure out how to open up the conversation so that the person gives you an on-ramp in which you can deliver your messages, whatever they are. So now what I want to do is pause and take your questions, because I know what I did was throw a giant landmine into a topic that, and I didn't give you easy answers. Before I open it up to questions, I want to do one commercial. We have a big event at the school coming up this Friday. Dr. Larry Barton, who's really the leading expert on crisis management and threat assessment, is going to be here doing a couple-hour session and sharing a lot of what he has learned. I have done a lot of work with Larry and clients of mine, and he has helped them work through a variety of very sticky situations. And every one of us, while we would like to think it won't happen, there's a high probability sometime in our career we'll be dealing with one. So hearing from a person who knows this field well is a rare opportunity. And I would encourage you, if you can attend, please come. There's a little RSVP at the bottom of this slide. Just send an email to that address. Let us know that you're interested, and we will be glad to see you on Friday evening. So with that, I want to open it up to your questions on the topics of feedback.
So go ahead and chat your question into the chat box and drop down to all attendees. We'll be watching the chat box. And I'm just going to leave this information about our event on this Friday up, so anybody who wants to take down the information will have ample time to do that. So we do have some comments coming in here. So Mike asks, what about individuals who consistently demonstrate a lack of self-awareness? That's a really good question. It makes it difficult to get self-discovery and sometimes causes defensive behavior. Have you ever encountered that, Jeff?
All the time. So the question, one of the ways we deal with it in leadership programming is to try to get people on videotape. So I had powerful sessions that I've done at other places where we have individuals work in a small group setting on a task, and they are videotaped while they do it, and then people can watch themselves operating in an environment and see their behaviors. And people will respond to seeing themselves often more readily than they would to feedback they receive from others. So we have to, when we have that person who just doesn't want to face it, we have to find creative ways for them to see it. I have another trick I use is I'll send the person away to go collect feedback and to come back to me and tell me what they learned. So if they have the charge to do it, rather than me owning it and giving it to them, it seems to be more effective.
Bill asks another really good question. So we talked about the different kinds of people. He asks, if people with a calm and even personality are less likely to be open to feedback, what is the best way to give someone with that personality feedback?
In that situation, you have to start by convincing them that it matters. Remember, they're not out looking for feedback. They're pretty confident. So that in their case, it's the business case and why they should pay attention. So I would spend all of my time with those folks saying, hey, here's the business challenge. Here's the behaviors you've been using. Here's the results you've been getting. Engage them in a dialogue that they want to get different results. Start to brainstorm with them what possibilities might exist for getting different results, but I hook them with the desire to have a different outcome. Because just going at them with feedback on behaviors is just going to bounce off.
Okay. And Raj, who must know the school well, asks a question having to do with the DISC model, which is a communication preference model. He asks, how do you give the feedback to a C-type personality in the DISC model? And for those of you not familiar with the DISC model, the C personality is the type of person who likes a lot of detail and facts. They want to have all of the T's crossed and the I's dotted. So what's the best way to give feedback to that kind of personality?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's hard to isolate that dimension only. I really want to know the whole person, so I need to know the other pieces of the DISC profile. But people who are conscientious, now the good thing is they're going to desire and want a lot of detail, and so if you could get them to participate in a 360 review, which gives them a lot of data, they're going to respond well to that. The challenge is those types of individuals often get lost in that data and fail to see the big picture and what really matters and which things are more important and why. So your job then is to help them sort of step above it all and select only a couple things that they really should focus on.
Great. And then Gary Conrad, one of our faculty members, asks, based on this research, how has it most significantly changed your approach to the performance appraisal process?
As I started out my hints, I spend enormous amounts of time investing in the relationship and getting to know the person. There are situations where I have worked with executives and I collect feedback of things they really need to know, but I won't give it to them for several months until I know them well enough and I know what's going on in their life, and I've developed a rapport and credibility with them, and I have just the right opportunity in the right kind of conversation when they are open to it, that I will slide it in. But I'm always thinking about the individual and who they are and what's going on and how's my relationship with them and is this a good time, and I'm looking for those moments in our interaction when it's just right for me to slip it in.
Great, thanks. And we do have a few more minutes, so if anybody has additional questions they'd like to type in, we can take those. So we'll give it another few seconds. And if everybody's questions have been addressed, we'll go ahead and close it up.
There's a great question here from Sergey about how should these conclusions and recommendations be adjusted and applied in a formal educational or instructional environment. What I've learned is that, A, people will respond best if they feel like the instructor has made an effort, as I said before, to get to know them. B, interestingly, we are often more open to feedback from our peers than we are from an authority figure. So to the extent that we can create situations throughout our leadership MBA program, for example, where teams of students can be working together and giving themselves each other feedback in a safe environment, it's more likely to be effective.
And then kind of flipping that around, Laura asks, so what can the recipient do to solicit more feedback if the people they need it from are reluctant or not forthcoming with feedback? How can they accelerate the process?
Provide the openings for people to give them feedback. Make it easy for them to give feedback, right? You are part of the relationship that needs to be in place here, so be receptive to that. Be open a little bit about who you are and what motivates you and what challenges you have so that the person on the other end of the spectrum is not guessing about how best to deliver it to you. So you're a party to this transaction as well.
Great, thanks. And then here's an interesting question from David. So is there another term or word that you would use for some people so that they can be more receptive to feedback?
Yeah, I think it's a great one. Don't use the word feedback. You know, try to position it as, hey, let's process this important interaction that just occurred. How did it go? What did you think, right? What went well? What would we do differently? And if you can engage them in the dialogue and they will offer some suggestions, it provides you an opening to say, you know, I had a similar observation. I thought that you did this really well, or hey, if you had done this, it would have been even more effective. That's another buzzword I've learned. Rather than saying you didn't do this well, if you can say, hey, you could have done this way to be even more effective, are some buzzwords that don't seem to raise the same alarm bells in individuals. I see Raj asked the question, what's your thoughts on feedback for the millennial generation? They want a lot of it, right? I've had interactions with students that I've met one time for 15 minutes and observed them in a meeting, and they find me and want feedback. And so you have to figure out how to engage with them in their development, but not always be providing feedback. So again, I try to engage them in a dialogue and get them to process it themselves rather than me being on the hook always to provide input. You're welcome, Raj.
Okay, well, it looks like we are coming to a close here. So I'd like to thank everybody for being part of this. And thank you to Jeff for this really great presentation on what's up with feedback. We hope you've enjoyed today's program with the Lake Forest Graduate School of Management. We're pleased to bring it to you. The Leadership Learning webinar series, of which this is a part, is an extension of the Business Management Education, which is also part of our Leader MBA program, iMBA Virtual Scenario-Based Program, and Corporate Learning Solutions. This program was made possible by our sponsor, Trustmark Foundation. Again, our deepest thanks for their support. We have a couple upcoming webinars as part of the Leadership Learning webinar series. You can see them on your screen. Our next one will be May 20th, and this will be on smart networking, delivered by our faculty member, Max Reed. And then in June, we will have a session on business writing, how to be effective with your business writing, delivered by Sangeeta Kasturi, another of the Lake Forest Graduate School of Management business leader faculty. So we value your feedback, so you will be receiving a link to a survey in a little while. Please take the time to complete it. We use your comments and information from these surveys to continually improve our sessions. Also included with that email will be the link to today's recorded session. This will all be in an email coming from Natalie Corrado, which she will send out to you later today. With that, we'd like to end the session and wish you a productive rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.